Dr. Wald. Walt, how are you doing today?
I am doing great. It's a beautiful, brisk day
Yeah, it's cold
here.
down here in Texas. Or I say
Yes,
cold. For us, it's cold. It's
I
cool.
know. We're like,
It's
it's freezing and it's,
right.
like 17 degrees up north. So,
So, have you been following the let me turn that off. The alleged winter blast that's going to wreak havoc across the U.S. Let me turn that off. I'm trying to.
is
Have
that
you?
what they're calling not tropical storm? Storm Izzy? Or,
Um, maybe that's what I'm confused about because so later in the week here in Texas, the lows will be 16 and 18. That'll be on Thursday and Friday.
ooh,
Yeah, and so I don't know if that's what that is or something else.
hmm, 16 as a
Yeah,
low.
yeah.
You
Yeah.
guys prepared this time?
Well, obviously not. I mean, that's a little too soon. I want to bring that up, but no, we're
Uh,
not. We're not prepared. So, but
huh.
anyways, okay.
We're supposed to get low 34. Although earlier in the week it said low 30, which is like pretty low. We could, I mean, if it does get below freezing here, then like if it gets below freezing here for like an extended period of time, then like half of the plants die. I did not know this when I moved here.
Mm,
And the first time that happened, I walked outside my backyard and I was like, what is that smell? It was just like dead, rotting plants.
mm, mm.
Yep. That's Florida. Florida
That
living.
is Florida.
Apparently in the South, the iguanas like freeze and then they'll fall out of the trees. So they have like these iguanas just like falling out of the trees, but they're not actually dead because they're whole-blooded. So they're just like stiff.
Mm.
And then like later it'll warm up and they'll like come alive and like walk off. We don't get those here. We don't have iguanas. We just have like little geckos. But I have never seen this personally, but I've heard about it. So
That's funny. So we had years ago. We had a bunch of turtles die, and I get we think we think we, we thought, and we don't know. It kind of warmed up, and then had like a cold snap like overnight. And we had like I don't know, we had a pond, and so there's like a dozen dead turtles, and so we always assumed that that's what killed them. But I don't know. It sounded like they would be more inclined to live like the iguana than that. But um, anyway,
I was really worried about our friend Anas's chickens during the last Texas freeze.
oh yeah, 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 yeah,
Didn't they
yeah.
like lay frozen eggs or something?
Mm, that whole period of time is a blur. We didn't have power for days. Um, that's when I drove to Oklahoma City because I was supposed to record with Ted Cruz. It was a whole thing. It was a whole thing. So
It was a thing.
yeah, I remember something about his chickens, but I don't remember. I don't remember all of it.
Well,
So
hopefully Texas will come through this latest freeze without much.
well, if we have here's the thing with the governor's race this year. If you had another freeze and mass power outages, that would probably be the end of it for Abbott. You'd assume.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So
Hmm.
so we
He gets a second term. I mean, he can run for a second term.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think I can't remember what the rules are. I, let's see. I think you can go on. Here. He's up for sure this one, but I'm not sure.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's no term limits, so he can run forever theoretically.
Huh. I know we have a governor's race too, but I guess in 2022. Yeah, I don't know.
Hmm. I guess we'll see. Okay, all right. Let's get into
Yeah,
the show. So,
talk about
Ellen,
Maryland.
yeah, Maryland. We have plants that are going from burning coal to burning oil. That's an interesting move,
Yes.
and one that won't get you any points. I don't think. Right? It's not going to score you any brownie points.
Well, this is what's kind of interesting about the whole thing. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things going on here, but so there are these two power plants that want to transition from coal to oil, and they are claiming that they don't. So they got a preliminary green light from the Maryland Public Service Commission, which is apparently something that they need or maybe don't need. It's kind of unclear, but the plants, Raven Power that operates both plants, says they need to get a new like certificate or something to change. But the people that own them say, actually, no, they shouldn't have to get a new certificate because shifting to oil will actually be decreasing air emissions. However, it's not really as like just because they say, because what's interesting is that they're saying that the plan that they have, it says the company based its estimates on the assumption that the plants, once they burn oil instead of coal, will operate at about 8% of their capacity due to the high cost of oil. So oil costs more, so they're just going to burn less oil, make less power, but they'll create less or fewer emissions. And as you can imagine, environmentalist groups are like, what? So this woman says, as far as we know, there's nothing to ensure that the operations will actually be done in accordance with that assumption. And then they're like, well, what happens if oil gets cheaper and then you decide to do more? So it just seems kind of insane. Like, why would you decide to switch from coal to oil when oil's really expensive and it's not going to do that much for you? Maybe switch to natural gas.
Yeah, I wondered the same thing. I didn't understand what the long term play is. I mean, if we look at oil prices today, Brent's 86, WTI is 84, natural gas is 4.28. I mean, it seemed, I don't know, maybe it's too much of a conversion to go to natural gas. I don't know, but long term, you think that would be the play?
Yeah. Well, then to me, it does seem like they're basically doing this to get out of needing a new certificate of whatever it is, because they say, so like the power plant people are saying, like, they stand by their 8% operation threshold during the permitting process. We're willing to limit operations and ensure there's no increase in emissions. And they previously said they were going to stop burning coal by the end of 2025. So maybe this is a way to switch without having to just to, like, they may just be doing this to avoid the like costs or whatever of the certificate. What is it called? Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity.
And necessity.
And necessity. It just seems like it's so obvious. Like, I don't know what other reason. They're not giving another reason. So maybe that is the reason, which strikes me as kind of shady.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it's more a bizarre story for sure. Okay, Bull Run rolls on despite possible China reserve release. Okay, where do you headline there? Well, okay, let's talk about this SPR mentality release. It would seem that China's got to put a bunch of barrels in the market to really, really lower down the prices. I mean, a lot of barrels.
yeah. I mean, have they said how much they're actually going to release? I mean,
sources told Reuters China plans to release oil reserves around the Lunar New Year, which is between January 31st and February 6th, as part of a plan coordinated by the United States and other major consumers to reduce global prices. That's like an article within the article.
Yeah. It's, it's so, it's like such a weird thing. I mean, can it really be called a coordinated release if it's like this late? Because it's not going to help. It's not going to achieve their purpose. I mean, they're probably just doing it now. Lunar New Year, everyone's traveling. If they are allowed to travel, who knows whether they're going to let people travel anyway in China.
Well, what I heard, I did hear the other day talking to someone, and they said that most people were leaving kind of a little bit early, trying to get to where they want to go. In case there's a lockdown, they can be at home, not at work.
Really? That's interesting. Because there are lockdowns already in some places, right?
And so they said they're going to be back at home and stuck at where they're working at. So
who wouldn't?
I mean, it would seem that.
Sorry, can't go to work.
Yeah, I don't know how you're going to SPR your way out of this. You know,
I think they're just doing it. I don't think it's gonna have an. I assume in China it will have like a minor effect on,
sure.
you know.
Uh-oh. The good doctor disappeared. I don't know if I booted her or if she left or what happened. Um, so we'll give her a second to come back. That was weird. I was looking at something else and poof, she was gone. Yeah, so China's SPR. I think that just kind of two things here I'll add while she's coming back in. There she is.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
I
One,
My browser just shut down.
no, it's okay.
Decided it wanted to take a break, I guess. But
Yeah, I was just saying the two things I would say is one, if we want to battle the high prices, we have to incentivize drilling, right? And so,
yep.
and we crushed the economy last year, or I guess 2 years ago now. We disincentivized drilling by shutting everything down, and we're paying the price for that. Two is this is just another reminder, we talk about quite often, that this whole peak global oil demand thing is nowhere near true, right? It's nowhere near, and so we have to quit. We're you're making people poor by promoting these policies, and so go ahead.
Yeah, isn't it cute how like peak oil demand just like disappeared from the conversation? That was like the
Oh yeah,
biggest thing in like 2018, 2019, and now it's just like no one's
yeah.
talking about that.
I mean, at the end of 2020, they were writing all the smart banks and people were writing stuff like, "Oh, hey, peak demand is it might never return. Oil and gas might never
No,
return to pre-pandemic levels." Okay, well
never.
that didn't last long, and so we crushed the industry via the shutdowns because we crushed the prices, and now we're paying for it. And again, it's an issue of it's just factually we need the oil, but on top of that, these higher prices do have impact. We talk about inflation and all that stuff. Well, higher prices, if the gasoline price keeps going up, people, it's going to impact you in a lot of areas, and that's just the way it is. And that's just a simple. There's a lot more than that. That's just a
Yeah.
simple way to think about it.
Is China what kind of inflation is China experiencing, or do they not experience inflation because the government like controls it? I don't know.
Well,
I know they're cutting. They said they're cutting interest rates because of their like bad real estate situation. But
yeah.
if the government controls the prices,
Yeah, I don't know what the current state of their inflation is. So I don't know. But to your point, they have all kinds of problems, and so why? I don't know. There's an article from Washington Post that inflation is not a problem. I don't know how it couldn't be, but okay, we'll see.
in China.
Question, yeah. We're
Okay.
hearing the supply chains are broken. Do you believe that we will need cheap energy resources, thus increase oil and gas to fix it?
That's
Dr. Wald, let's
good.
go first.
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, I think. Okay, this is my theory. I definitely think there are clearly supply chain issues. That's obvious. However, I do think that supply chain issues have also become a catch-all excuse for things that are not actually supply chain issues. So, there are clearly supply chain issues affecting energy if you can't get the products that you need or you don't have enough truck drivers or whatnot. But like I also think that like not everything is a supply chain issue. Like you go to like Trader Joe's and you're like, hey, how come there are no animal crackers for months and months and months? So like they're stuck on a ship in the port and you're like, come on, don't give me that. Like I know that you don't source your animal crackers from China, so
Mm-hmm.
like so I do think I think like blaming everything on supply chain, like the cars thing. Maybe there are some supply chain issues, but at the same time, these kinds of like things I think are being way exploited because I think car dealerships really want to move to a model where they like having a scarcity of cars because then they can charge more for them. It's so it's I just think that it's not as people are using it as an answer to everything and why they don't have things immediately at the prices they want when in fact there are lots of other things going on here, like people realizing there are other models for sale that might be better for them. There's inflation, there's other things. I do think that cheaper oil and gas would certainly help with inflation. Cheaper oil and gas can help, with the economy. Sometimes it can really help like jumpstart things, but we're not going to see lower prices on goods simply because energy costs come down. I do think the one thing that would help with is food. It could help with food prices, at least in terms of the fertilizer issues. I think that we're going to be seeing a lot of increased food prices due to rising costs of fertilizer as we head into like summer and stuff. I don't think that that's necessarily hitting us now, but it will be. And so there are definitely things that cheaper energy could solve, but not everything.
Right. And the other thing is, I think you're right to say it is a catch-all. So if you follow our buddy Mark Rosano, he'll talk about crop yields. Okay, and so a crop yield in Brazil or China might be down. Well, is that a supply chain issue? Well, it depends on how you view it, right? So if you're saying we import, X number of this crop into the U.S., we can't get it because the crop's not growing. Well, that is part of the supply chain, but it's not necessarily a logistical problem as we think about it. So to your point, you have to kind of unpack what each of these issues are before you can kind of say. So would lower oil and gas would not fix crop yields because the crops aren't growing because they're not getting rain. I mean, that's
but what if they're not getting enough fertilizer?
Well, yes, yes, it could be. If the one I'm thinking of, I think, is a rain issue, but it's a fertilizer. If it's a fertilizer issue, then yes. Now you could say that the oil and gas would be cheap enough they could import the water or whatever. So to your point,
Yeah,
I think,
but that's a logistical nightmare.
right. Yeah, right. It's unlikely. So I think on some things it is possible, and then like on the car stuff, the chip shortages out of Taiwan. I don't know if oil and gas would fix that or not. I think that's another water issue, if I remember correctly. So some of this stuff is definitely driven by. If you read some of these port stories, we talked about this a month ago. It was DeSantis was like, come down to Florida, our ports are open, and they couldn't open them up in Los Angeles. And it's like I don't know what the deal was. That this COVID restrictions, people not show up for work. I don't know, but I don't think oil and gas fixed that problem though.
My understanding of at least the problem at the Long Beach port was that there are restrictions on how many containers ports can store. So like you can't just like stack up the containers until they're like as high as, a 10-story building. And so containers are coming in and they're being stacked and they're not being taken away because there are limits on like truck drivers, and the truck drivers couldn't get in to take the old containers away. And so that limited the amount of new containers they could bring in. So, which seems to me like you could fix that pretty quickly by eliminating some of the impediments to storing old containers or finding new places to store the old containers so that then you can bring the new containers in. So, but I think that like it's more than just that. That's like one particular issue.
Sure. Yeah, it's a lot of issues that are tied directly or indirectly to the supply chain. The other thing is, when you think about, we always talk about the Jones Act, right? So they'll, after a hurricane, they'll drop the Jones Act. And so when think about all the policies and all the things we've done to the economy over the past, 24 months, and all the regulations that kind of were in place that kind of let the economy run before. And now you're saying, okay, well, to your point, you have these container things. Well, the container flow is different now. I don't know, but theoretically, or the hours truck drivers can drive, or the amount of truck drivers. So all these things that have regulations on them worked before you messed up everything, and now you've kind of start back up. You're going to have fits and starts.
Basically.
Okay. Let's see here. U.S. to talk to energy firms on EU gas supply in case of a Russia-Ukraine conflict. I'm about Europe out. I'm about Europe out of this deal. I don't know. How did we get here? This seems to be. This is not okay. I can get people. Like 2020, I have a lot of problems with the response, but at least you can say it kind of snuck up on people. They were surprised. This European stuff is not like some new leader took over and he changed how everything was ran. The European policies have been flawless. Like, how have they not seen this for years and years and years coming up? We talked about this as long as I've known you. We've talked about this issue.
Mm-hmm. Yep. This is my favorite thing from the article. So now that like Russia is like on the border of Ukraine. Ukraine, by the way, apparently asked Germany if it would supply it with defensive missile or defensive weaponry, and Germany just said no today. So that doesn't sound good. I mean, what did they expect? Germany, whatever.
Germany wants to work with the Russians.
So apparently the U.S. is concerned. Yeah. I think they remember like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Well, that was really where Germany double-crossed Russia. So,
but I mean, that's anyway. The thing. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so anyway, back to energy. But so Russia denies it's planning to attack Ukraine, but apparently the U.S. is concerned about it, or the U.S. thinks it's going to put sanctions on Russia. So it says any interruptions to Russia's gas supply to Europe would obviously exacerbate the current crisis. So here's what it says. State Department officials approached the companies. Which companies? We don't know. Presumably not Gazprom. Like what companies are they talking about?
Well,
to ask where additional supplies might come from if they are needed. Two industry sources familiar with the discussions told Reuters. The companies told the U.S. government officials that global gas supplies are tight, and there's little gas available to substitute large volumes from Russia. They're basically like, if you do this, Europe is screwed because we don't have any extra gas to send. It kind of reminds me of during the 1956 Suez Crisis. So that was when Nasser took control of the Suez Canal from the British and the French. And the British and the French were like, no, we don't like that. And so they tried to invade. And Nasser responded by sinking a whole bunch of ships throughout the Suez Canal, effectively blocking oil from the Middle East to Europe. And the U.S. had actually like anticipated that something like this might happen, and they had gone and they had like a committee with Europe, and they basically got all of the big oil companies to create these plans, like these coordinated plans that would ordinarily not be allowed under like collusion law, to figure out how to supply Europe with other sources of oil in the event that this happened. So they had all these plans in place. They were ready to implement them. And when Nasser actually did sink these ships, and they wanted to put them into place because they couldn't get, otherwise they have to sail around Africa. And Eisenhower was like, no, let's hold off because I didn't want that, like the British and the French basically invaded without his approval, and he didn't think that they should have. And so he basically held off on these plans. He wouldn't grant the U.S. companies, he wouldn't grant them immunity from antitrust violations for this plan. So he basically like kind of starved France and Britain out of oil until they relented and withdrew their troops. Of course, in this case, they're like, please, like, help us figure something out. And they're like, sorry, we ain't got none to spare.
Well, we had on Sergio Chop on the Texas Oil and Gas podcast last week, and he was talking about these LNG tankers that were going, on the west side of the Panama Canal and getting paid to turn around and go back through the Panama Canal and go all the way back to Europe. And I think he said the fee to go through is like $300,000 or $400,000.
Oh, yeah.
And so of course it's
plus all the fuel to like do that.
Right. So again, it's one of these things. It's when we had Secretary Perry out there with the Freedom Gas and all that stuff, and I really just I'm at a loss here, because if you want to do deals with the Russians, then so be it. But like this is part that comes with the package.
Yeah.
Like it's infuriating.
It sure is.
And then you have a ton of terrible government policy to go on top of it as well that ruins the energy industry.
Yeah.
So, okay, so let's see here. We got I think one more time before the woman. Europe's government faces a reckoning as energy prices surge, kind of piggybacking on what we just talked about.
Yeah.
Um, I mean,
Well, one of
what?
the things that was interesting is so actually energy prices went down like 10% today because I don't know, there were a bunch of factors, but it's still like if you look at a chart of it in like the past like couple months, it looks like way down. If you look at like a chart of the past couple of years, it's like that wasn't such a
Yeah,
big
it's
drop.
blip.
It's
Right.
still really expensive.
Yeah. I mean, how much? Obviously, the European citizens can't do a whole lot right now. It's cold over there. Talk about being cold. It's cold over there, I'm sure. But as things thaw out and it warms up, I mean, what do you think the fallout of this is going to be?
I mean, people are going to be paying a lot. I mean, I don't know how it works exactly in Europe, but I know like when in New England, for example, when they had the cold snap and prices went up a lot, people weren't really going to be paying for it until like September.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wonder like how much are they going to? I mean, I assume people are already seeing higher bills in Europe because they keep talking about like keeping the heat really low. Did you see the sock thing? This is hilarious.
Mm-mm.
Okay, so some company, I thought originally it was Germany, but apparently it was in England, sent its like customer, it was like a utility company, they sent them like socks. And they were like, wear warm socks,
Oh no!
But their socks, because they're like, because energy prices are really high and the price of oil is high, the socks were made out of polyester.
Polyester.
Which, first of all, does not give you that warm, and second of all,
Right.
is a petroleum product.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious.
Couldn't even get some wool socks.
Oh man. I don't know.
Yeah, they had to apologize for that because that was like my other favorite one was they recommended eating porridge to keep warm and snuggling with your pet.
Wow.
How about like better insulating your dwelling?
Yeah, I know we have listeners across the pond there. So let's see here. Yeah, well, we got. I'm looking at the chart. Here's the countries we rank in on this show. Okay, we're in Romania, the UK, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Austria, Hungary. Okay, I am hungry. That's the problem. I'm on this little intermittent fast deal, but hungry. Those countries we all rank in over there. So, of course, Saudi's not in Russia. I mean, Saudi's not in Europe. So, we'd love to hear from you. Shoot us a note. How are you guys surviving the energy crisis, whatever you want to call it? Because from over here, it's really hard to tell. It's and maybe it's partially like with the Texas freeze. That there's some people in the Texas freeze, they never lost power, and so for them the freeze wasn't a big deal. So maybe there's people it's not really impacting, and others it's disproportionately impacting. So I'd be curious to see what happens, but it's going to have to reshape some of the energy policy moving forward, huh?
I mean, I would hope so. I mean, England says they're burning a lot more oil today. And New England. So this was apparently really big on Twitter yesterday, was the fact that 55% of the electricity of the power being generated in New England is coming from like coal and oil or oil right now, which is not a surprise. But I was like, oh my gosh. The other funny thing was if you looked at their power mix, under renewables, they count wood. And like, from what I feel like, okay, again, like wood pellets, okay, I guess it's renewable, but it's not clean. Like, you burn wood pellets, you're releasing, I know that like, okay, the trees take in the carbon dioxide, and so that you're burning it, so maybe like the net carbon dioxide is still the same over like the lifespan of the tree. And yeah, like I did studies, ninth grade biology and photosynthesis and all that, but like, come on, like burning wood emits a lot of stuff into that. Like, it's not clean. It is possibly renewable, but it's not clean. So I thought that was a little bit disingenuous. But so like, so this like image or whatever was going around and was like, need more renewables. It's like, no, need more natural gas pipelines.
Yeah, well,
They did the same thing happened in the winter of 2017 with that cold snap.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay,
Yeah.
Dr. Foreman is in the green room. I think he's ready. Let's
Yay.
bring him on here. We'll put him on the big screen just like that. Well, no, let's see. There we go. Moving around. Okay, musical chairs. There we go. Dr. Foreman, good to see
Hey,
you. How are you doing, sir?
very well. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, you
Yeah.
sound
Good,
good.
good.
Hope you had
Happy
a
New Year again.
wonderful holiday season. Yeah, it's our first time for 2020 part two, so it's good to have you on. Okay, well, let's get into your monthly statistical report, which will come out on the 21st. So this will be out on this Thursday. I'm stunned. I'm stunned reading these reports about strong oil and gas demand. I can't believe that we're seeing these reports. Were you as stunned as I was?
I think there are a couple of surprises in this month's report. It, Look, the demand strength has been resilient, and I think the fact that it just kind of got turned up a notch by Omicron, actually. So you saw more driving, less flying, more diesel, freight shipping, and on top of this, a lot more materials that are feeding the medical plastics and sterile packaging and everything that comes with COVID. So that just took that to a record high, and we've continued to see that strength. Plus, eh, it's not just the US, right? I mean, our data as a primary data source are in the US, but when you look at EIA's report, it was resounding that on a global basis, they showed that global demand for liquid petroleum fuels rose to 101 million barrels per day in December. So back above 100. And they're projecting it by the end of 2023 to get to, I think it's 103.4. So, energy transition aside, this is continued global, uh, very strong demand growth that's going to take some serious investment for the supply side to catch up.
Yeah, that's what we just talked about earlier, which is China's looking to release their SPR. There's some kind of global coordinated SPR release, and it's like we devastated the industry by crushing demand in 2020, and that's going to take a long time to unwind some of that stuff.
Absolutely. And from a price inflation side, a supply chain side, and it's not just the energy industry. When we're talking semiconductors, automotives, so many things have longer legs to them in terms of the recovery and the price inflation implications than what we've seen so far. And I think we've been ahead of the curve as API in saying, hey, look at this. We saw the dearth of investment. We saw it was taking longer starting in the middle of last year, but it's continuing very much into 2022.
Yeah, one of the things I thought was super interesting was how much of the intermediate. You mentioned the demand for petrochemicals for medical grade plastics and the demand for intermediate products. But at the same time, we're actually seeing, you said, lower exports of petroleum products. So it just seems like we're making a lot more at home, and consuming it also at home, or are these just natural variations in exports?
No, thanks so much for that, because I mean that really is an insightful question in that that's what's new, actually, the insight coming out of this month's report that we haven't seen so much before. So what we have seen before is strong demand, supply not keeping up, crude oil inventories down, US imports of petroleum up, right? And that's historically been a recipe for upward pressure on prices. What is new is that here, when we look at the level of refining activity, and this is, again, surveying up to 90% of the industry every week, it's primary data coming right from the refiners, right? We're seeing that the level of activity, of refining activity, it's ratcheted up, but it's still like the second lowest capacity utilization and throughput for the month of December in almost a decade or more. So, I mean, that's point one. And then these refined product exports having dropped off at a time that we know global demand is up, that is also a direct impact or a follow-on impact coming from the dearth or the relative lack of investment in domestic production. So what's happening is, as we are now importing, our difference between domestic and
Mhm.
international crude oil prices is minimal. It's not the $5 and $7 per barrel that we saw in mid 2019. It's just $2, $3 per barrel, and in some days, just cents on the barrel. And with that, you have such a minimal difference between it that the only thing you can do, it has reduced the margins so much on that that it's making U.S. refiners, therefore, not the preferred platform for exporting petroleum products to the rest of the world. And that's a big change.
But are we but we're not seeing less refining, so we're consuming these things at home, I guess.
Well, okay, we're up year on year, but comparing back to last year, again, it is relatively weak. January 2020 was or 2021 was still relatively weak. Here, or December 2020 at that point, we are seeing both a drop in
Okay.
the refining activity relative to where it would have been in 2019, and the fact that our exports are down. So getting hit is kind of a double whammy in that sense, in that
Okay.
you're not getting quite the activity level. And now that you don't have that feedstock advantage in supplying the rest of the world, you're less apt to invest. So there's a multiplier effect that goes with that. This is jobs, it's economic activity, it's
I
investment,
see.
and it's community development across the Gulf Coast. It's Appalachia that might look at being able to export natural gas. Now, natural gas is a little different than petroleum products right now in that globally it's in really strong demand. But curiously, the drilling activity has been relatively flat. So we haven't seen what we have there is a problem with infrastructure of getting access to these markets.
That's very, very interesting.
I'm getting a lot of typing sound, so it's okay.
Let's talk about the distillate economic indicator, because it seems like
Absolutely.
there were some interesting things going on there.
So look, this looks at distillate or diesel fuel stocks, turnover, the demand for it, and both as a level and a year-on-year change in it. It also has some things about crude oil prices, how those are evolving, and then some risk spreads, so some interest rates that go in there. And all of these have been really interesting lately, right? Because we've seen a lot of really big changes both year on year in, well, longer term interest rates. Everything across the board has been perking up along with inflation here. What is interesting is that it's still suggesting on the industrial side that you'd continue to see growth. And the indicator, if you're comparing to year on year changes in industrial production, it's actually kind of moved sideways. The indicator has the last 2 to 3 months, whereas industrial production had still been on a downward trajectory. And historically, because this is a leading indicator, that kind of suggests that the underlying industrial activity is strong enough that this is an indicator that perhaps going forward, it'll sustain. So if the industrial side of it does pretty well in terms of activity levels, then we look at the consumer side of it to say, how is U.S. economic activity and growth going? And that's where we see some weakness, right? So the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index, which is probably the best survey of how consumers are feeling, what their expectations are, it's dropped to some of the lowest levels in a decade in the recent months. And if you overlay a growth of consumer spending with that index and the change of it, it tends to correlate really strongly with where consumer spending growth goes. So that's 70% of the U.S. economy on an expenditure basis is consumer spending. That will be quite a headwind if that ends up bowing down to these inflationary pressures that are causing a lot of angst.
So let's talk about inventories for a second. The total inventories is the lowest since December of 2017. The crude oil is below the 5-year range, and the lowest for December since 2014. With all that we've heard about lack of drilling in the U.S., we talk about the destruction of the demand the past couple of years, how that's impacted drilling. How concerned should we be that prices could stay high for a long period of time? Is this something that we can recover quickly, or is this we should really be following this? We're in trouble here.
Well, I can't predict the price. I can say that I think from a tightening market fundamental standpoint, the combination of factors that we surveyed would be of concern here. And, you know, you're you're perfectly on point to highlight that our inventory as we're tracking is excluding the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. You just mentioned earlier, Ellen, how China's released some things too. So when you put these things together, it's like, okay, we're using Strategic Petroleum Reserves to try to politically manage some prices through holiday season coming into the new year. I think they, some might have their eyes on the midterm elections and politically where these things go, but there may actually come a time if the economy globally stays on track, demand continues to grow, and the supply really physically just can't keep up. Because Ryan, as you're saying, it does take a long time, and outside of the U.S. and OPEC spare capacity, where else are you going to invest and get it to market relatively quickly in time to meet that demand? We've been tracking for fully a year the fact that this was likely to be a market shortage if the economy stayed on track, and that's been the uncertainty. But it's pretty clear by the numbers that it would take a dramatic change for the quantum of economic growth to translate into something meaningfully different on the oil side at this point. So we need the investment. The market needs the barrels to be able to make ends meet. And it's going to test the limits here in terms of where we're going because, you know, in the past, the trade-offs haven't been so stark. We've had this abundance for 5 or 10 years. People have become accustomed to it and just sort of taken it for granted. And now that it's not there, I think the rest of the world is collectively going to have to step up and kind of figure out, okay, can you get more barrels out of Brazil, or what is Russia willing to do? And could you see Iran step up or Venezuela step up in a way that historically they haven't been able to?
So let me pick on that for a second there, because if I'm hearing you correctly, obviously you can't predict prices, but we can just look at these numbers and say, hey, if we keep drawing from storage, the price will go up, generally speaking. That's not good for the average consumer. The alternative is an economic, I don't know if you said reset, but economic slowdown, which is not good for the average consumer. It feels like the average Joe is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place unless we can figure out a reasonable way to put barrels on the market in the next 12 months or so.
No, I think that's right. And you're not, if you slow the economy so much, everybody globally and in the US suffers, right? And what we're looking at is, and EIA's estimation is really interesting here because I don't know if you take apart their short-term energy outlook, they have a global supply-demand balance that's factored into it. And the thing that was most interesting to me in the revisions that came out last Wednesday were that last year they were showing like more than 5 million barrels per day of rebound in demand, but relatively little in terms of what came back on supply. This year they're showing less. They're showing like 3.5, a little north of that in terms of demand growth for this year globally. But they think that the supply growth will be robust, that it'll be more like 5 to 5.5 million barrels per day. And you have to ask yourself, okay, what is it in the U.S. that would bring those barrels? And then above and beyond U.S. and other non-OPEC supply, if you were to take that as given that non-OPEC produces flat out as much as it can, then why would OPEC pile on and have another 3.6 million barrels per day of growth year on year as a result of that? And I don't know the answer to it, because I can't see with the U.S. drilling activity how we get to the numbers, based on the pulse of where drilling has actually gone so far. To average growth of 1.2 million barrels per day in the U.S. this year, we have to start adding a lot materially every week starting now for the year to average that, right? It's like, and right now, actually, in the last EIA report for last week, we went down, not up in terms of production. So these are challenges, and I think you recapped it just right, but it's a cauldron in terms of the potential pressures here.
And one more thing there, I guess, is the duck debate is over, right? We're not like we've gone long enough that whatever was going to happen with the ducks, we can no longer count on them to save the day if they ever were going to.
They're not completely gone. In the Permian, basically by EIA's estimates, you cut the ducks in half. And when we look at some of the revised estimates, it looks like almost half of the completions in the Bakken last year came out of ducks as well. And nationwide, there still are some ducks, don't get me wrong, but you're going to fundamentally need more drilling activity to meet growth, not just kind of hold up at a flat level of production, because we haven't materially grown or broken out the upside in production just using minimal drilling and ducts. So Ellen, I could turn it on
sorry,
you.
I was muted. I was muted. So what one of the interesting things though is it seems everything is either above average or above the 5-year average or below the 5-year average, whichever indicates more, except for jet fuel deliveries. And you mentioned Omicron as a reason for people flying less, which is understandable. But what if we do see a really big or at least a rebound in jet fuel in air travel? Can we do we have the fuel for this? Even for a rebound in air travel.
The production of jet fuel as a mix out of refineries and what's going to market is historically low. So refiners have adapted to the fact that the demand hasn't been there. Days on supply, have kind of normalized to the smaller demand that's going. And I think look, they can change that mix in terms of what they process and produce relatively more of that and relatively less of something else if it comes to it. It is a fair question. If you have crude oil inventories at 5-year lows or below 5-year lows, how much more could you go? Then it becomes a matter of price, right? I mean, you can get the barrels at a price, and we'll have to see. I think the surprising thing to me wasn't the jet fuel, that the gap with Omicron, it had for several months kind of closed the gap versus 2019 levels, been strengthening, and then fell out of bed the latter half of December as Omicron set in. And residual fuel oil, the bottom of the barrel, there's always a certain cut of the barrel that's going to be heavier molecules that goes, and you can spend some, and Gulf Coast refiners in particular have invested to be able to upgrade that further into lighter products. But the demand for that, we noticed in November, had doubled compared to where it was in the prior year. And it actually held up very strongly in December. And this is also a tightening supply chain issue where we're seeing marine shipping consuming a lot of this, and the more ships that have installed scrubbers to be able to take this higher sulfur fuel and in a regulatory sense be able to use it cleanly, that's been actually really resounding as well. So a surprise coming out of the demand side, out of a product that's a niche product, not very large in the US, but still important globally.
I'm really interested to see the motor gasoline deliveries for January, mostly because I've been kind of wondering about the impact of these school closures and things like that. If it's something that we'll see if these school closures and other work closures will show up on if it's enough to actually make a difference in national gasoline demand stats. Fortunately, it might be hard to kind of pick it apart because we've got a lot of winter weather that also complicates motor gasoline deliveries. But it's interesting because you have here that this was the highest for December since 2018, and you're accounting that for more driving and less flying. So I'm curious. I'm interested to see what we think might happen in January.
It's a fair question, and I don't know. I mean, here where we are in Maryland, we haven't seen the schools shut actually, and instead of taking school buses, you have more parents driving the kids to school, actually. But with the extension of Omicron, you also have less commuting to work. And this gets into, you see some of this, right, in the reformulated versus conventional gasoline mix that is in the gasoline data that we report in the MSR. And it's interesting that the conventional part, which is more rural areas, it's what you'd get if you were taking a holiday trip across the country and not flying. That was actually up, but the urban part, the reformulated gasoline in urban areas, that actually took a hit more. So that made sense. It jibed with what was happening with COVID.
All right, Dr. Foreman, anything that we missed that you wanted to hit on before we got out of here today?
Well, I think we've covered all the basics. It's just a really interesting time of year of trying to read the tea leaves on where it's going. It's nice that it's been consistent in the data through year end, and I think it provides a jump off point where, if there's any question that the economy is strong, uh, despite the uncertainties about price inflation, the pandemic, the wearing off of stimulus, it's pretty clear the economy, both in the US and globally, has been really solid in terms of the growth numbers. So with that, I think we have to have some cogent policy that takes that as some degree of confidence and starts to make sure that the things that are going to make this affordable for consumers actually start to take hold. And that's where I think we're lacking right now.
I'm muted. Okay, I'm muted. Okay, all right, Dr. Foreman, thank you so much. This report will be out on Thursday, so be sure to go to
Actually,
API.
Friday.
Friday, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Friday, okay.
We're delayed.
API.org on the top right, correct?
Yes, with the Monday holiday, we're delayed to Friday the 21st. And at api.org, the upper right is the Chief Economist section where you can find the MSR, the latest one, our quarterly report, and all the articles.
Okay, look forward to getting you on next month as always, and we'll talk to you then.
Great speaking with you both, and Happy New Year again.
Bye.
All right, Dr. Wall, anything else before we get out of here today?
Well, it's an interesting report, I think
Demand's back.
Do you think this means we're in for? Yeah. Do you think this means we're really in for like $100 oil, $120 oil this summer when demand is really strong?
Well, I think his point about the economy is interesting. I'm not an economist, obviously, but as the price goes higher, you would expect people to have to change their habits. They can't afford $90 oil. Now, how much of that can they slow back? And theoretically, they could slough off some, but the drilling's still not high enough. So yeah, I think that you could see really high prices if we don't see more drilling. Of course, OPEC, who knows what they're going to do here in a few months, and he brought up, I think it was him that brought up Russia. What do you think Russia's going to do with these high prices? Well,
yeah, Russia doesn't generally want prices that are that high. I mean, if you look at who's adding oil in OPEC, and one of the other things that we didn't mention this because it's a U.S. kind of focused report, but just because OPEC says it's increasing production quotas by 400,000 barrels a day doesn't mean that that's actually going on the market. And we've only had, we only had, I think, 310,000 barrels added to the market last month from OPEC. And part of that was Saudi Arabia just didn't increase its full quota, and neither did Russia. I think Russia's increasing a little bit. The question is how much can Russia increase? I think it's generally easier for them to do that during the summer than in the winter, but they may not increase that much even if they're allowed to. Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia, I think they will continue to increase their production, and so will the UAE. But is it going to be enough? I don't know. And then also, how will that impact China? Right. Will China just cut its imports, because that could push the price down? I mean, Saudi Arabia just cut its prices to Asia because they're concerned that China's not buying enough. I think there's a lot going on here. It's not just U.S. drilling.
I'm going to solve it all right here.
An important factor.
I'm going to solve it all right here. Okay, Xi Jinping, hear me out. Get on the horn with Iran and Venezuela. Okay, and you work out a deal with the Saudis or I don't know, some other oil producing country to let them help them get their production back up. It brings the price back down. It saves the Chinese economy. It's a win-win-win for everyone. So China with Iran and Venezuela, some kind of partnership to get their production up. That would be, because Venezuela obviously has the spare capacity. I don't know to bring the prices down, but they obviously have a ton of spare capacity. I don't know how much spare capacity Iran has, but Venezuela has a lot.
I think they claim that within several months they could be increasing their production for like 1 million barrels a day, and that's a lot to put on the market. One of the things that I have been saying and kind of wondering about is look, if the Biden administration is, I mean, abysmal, they've got terrible approval rating, inflation is 7%. As we get closer to the midterms, are they going to be kind of desperate for some kind of win to tout, or at least that they can give to their, congressional, candidates to tout? Are they going to really try to push for some kind of diplomatic breakthrough with Iran that would allow Iran to produce and sell more oil, even if they don't get materially much in response? I just think that as they get potentially more desperate, that's something that we should look for, because and that could add 1 million barrels to the market within. I think Iran probably overestimates how much they they can ramp up as quickly as they can do it, but they're not. It's not like they're gonna. They'll have buyers. I mean, I don't think that they'll have people very happy to buy it. So I just think that's as things kind of get worse for the Biden administration, I think that becomes a greater potential thing that we could see. And obviously they may be doing it for the political implications, but it will have oil market implications.
Well, another thing is this isn't a presidential election year, and so all the races. I mean, you have state races like governor and senator maybe, but the congressional races, they're hanging on for their lives, and they don't have a president that has to win as well. They just got to stay in office, and so the messaging on the right and the left will shift, because local district races is what really matters. And so I think, to your point about you might see policy shift, but you also see a lot of interesting talking points, because if your district is struggling, prices are high, you might see some Democrats come out in favor of more drilling because they need to win re-election, and the Republicans
That's a really good point.
It's just a localized race.
I'd love if we could get some candidates on the show to discuss that, because that could be a very interesting thing to hear as we get closer. Yeah.
Okay. All right, Dr. Wald, where will you be this week?
This week I will be on investing.com with my usual column, and I have got some things in the fire now, but probably won't be appearing until next week. So
okay. And I have Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, who testified in if you remember, the Jerry Sandusky trial. I think she testified, or she at least worked on it some. But she also tested in the Epstein case, the Maxwell case. She testified for Maxwell recently. And so she has a theory on repressed memory, that basically you can fool people's memory. And so she's kind of an expert on that. So she'll be coming out on Inside the War Room. Okay. All right, that being said, everyone, we'll be back next week, right? Yeah, back next week.
Yeah,
and we'll
next week.